Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. Today we'll be talking about why cavalry play is much better for beginners rather than pretty much any other unit in the game. We're talking the knight line, so knight, cavalier, and paladin, pretty much outperforming everything else. Now before I start this video, let me go ahead and give you guys a really quick story that you're going to want to hear out because it's pretty much sums up exactly what I'm talking about here. So I was doing coaching with a guy the other day and he came in to me. First session, he was an archer player. That's what he knew. He was a pretty, beginner player. So he knew archers. We sat down, we played, and we had trouble beating the hard AI. Now he's beaten the hard AI with archers before. It's not like it was impossible for him, but it was pretty tricky. The second session we had in coaching, I switched it up and I said, hey, let's try out some cavalry civs. I think it'll be easier for you. We demolished the hard AI 2 games in a row in the most consistent way possible, and I'm sure if he just goes ahead and plays himself in the same style, he'll beat the hard AI easily the same way every time. Now the reason this is the case is kind of like a little obvious once you give it some thought, but there's a lot of reasons, so it's not just one thing you can point to that makes cavalry play better for beginner players. Let's go ahead and compare cavalry play to some of the other options that you can have available to you. So obviously we've got archer play, so the archer line being a pretty strong unit. You've also got infantry options like pikemen and militia that people like to, make their main style. And then you have other niche options like eagle warriors, step lancers, cavalry archers, elephant archers. Those are mainline units or, regional units that are also solid, and some players like to play with them. They have their place in the game. And remember, as a pro player, you always have to mix and match whatever you want to go for. But generally speaking, for beginner players, it's much better to have a simple and easy to execute game plan, which is why players, whether they're thinking about it or not, tend to always go towards one kind of unit choice, and they don't tend to mix and match too much. So the reason why the knight line is just the absolute best for beginners over the other options is simply because it is less micro intensive. Well, I say simply, but that is one of the reasons. There's many, as I will mention, and they also fight really well on their own. So this is completely different to any other unit in the game. For example, if you take a look at the archer, it's very micro intensive. You have to hit and run constantly or else you're underperforming, and they don't fight very well on their own. Even if you patrol a group of archers in, you will miss a lot of your shots. You will do overkill on a lot of your shots. You will also take a lot of damage as you're just standing still and not dodging any of the enemy projectiles. This is not how you fight with archers or how you'd want to fight with archers. Whereas if you compare it with the knights, even the knight under a pro player will have to run in there and fight, and the knight under a regular patrol will run in there and fight. So as you can see, there's not much micro involved with going with a knight attack. All you have to do is send them in, choose your fights wisely, and take it for the best outcome. Obviously, if you get really good at the game, you can start pulling away the low HP cav units, you can start dodging projectiles and all that fancy stuff. But at the base, for the beginners, you get a really good value from just patrolling your knight and letting it fight, assuming the fight is a decent one to take in the first place. The idea that the cavalry unit is much easier to micro helps a lot for the player, not just in the fight, but actually manage his economy at home. Remember, Age of Empires 2 is a holistic game. It's not just about one thing or another. You can't just focus on one area and, hope to win it. You have to focus on the entire game at the same time. And that is why when you're taking fights with cavalry, you can easily look away and fix your economy, create more units, think about the next step of the game. Whereas if you're microing archers and you're a beginner player, it's going to be very hard for you to focus on the micro, hit and run, and also think or even have the time to go back and make units and fix your economy. This is almost impossible to do if you're, a newer player, or even just someone who doesn't have a lot of games under their belt and is not 100% familiar with all the hotkeys. So in general, knights will get you more value in fights. They give you more time at home to fix your economy, to think about the next steps, and you still get a lot of value from them just fighting on their own, which is amazing for what you want to do as a beginner, which is taking things one step at a time. Not just that though, but the knight is also less fragile in general. So when you think about an archer mass or even an infantry mass or even a cavalry archer mass, in general they tend to be slightly more fragile. If you look away for a second, an enemy has mangonels or heavy siege or even just attacks you with their own knights, your units will die rather quickly because they have low HP and low armor. Whereas the knight is pretty much alone in this regard as being a fast unit with high armor, high HP, and high attack. So as you can see, it's a pretty well-rounded unit, and even if you're not looking when things are going down, you're focusing on your base, no one can really surprise your knights and kill all of them before you can react. The worst that can happen is pikemen engage you, but even then, in the worst case, you can always just run away, take a few losses, and go from there. Whereas if you've got other army like infantry, which are lacking mobility, archers, which are lacking mobility and are fragile, you can lose your entire army just because you weren't looking. And let's be be honest, there's so many things to look at in Age of Empires 2. I mean, you got your economy, you've got your military production, you've got your expansion, you've got tasking every villager. There are so many things that could take your attention that you're not always monitoring your army. And losing your army because you just weren't looking is kind of bad. And the Knights lets you get away with just taking a few losses and running away. And that's a much better outcome to a mistake like that, which tends to happen more often than not at lower level play because it's just simply hard to manage everything at the same time. Let's talk a little bit about the mobility though, and the mobility is a huge aspect that the Knight has over infantry and archer play. And when I talk about archers, I'm also including skirmishers, by the way, because they kind of go hand in hand. So the mobility advantage that the Knight gets you, it's really good in multiple situations. Number one, it lets you avoid bad situations or bad fights simply by running away. And this makes it so you don't need to be calculating your moves. If you've got an archer mass, you want to move out, you have to think, oh, does my opponent have a lot of army? Will he clear me up? Is it safe to move out? With Knights, you can just move out. You don't have to even give it a second of time of thought, nothing at all. Just move out, and if the situation is bad, all you gotta do is run away and you lose pretty much nothing every single time. The mobility also lets you target units that are running away from you, or you can target villagers more easily. You can pick off stray units. These are the kind of things that it's easy to understand are good plays. When it comes to archer units, it's hard to get value. It's not intuitive what's getting you value, what's a good thing to go for. Whereas with Knights, because you're easily able to run into dicey situations and risky territory, you can just run in, look for stray units and kill them and run away. It's a very simple plan, very easy to understand plan, and a very repeatable plan because you can do this, run back, run away, heal or whatever, and then run in, do the same thing again, and you get a ton of value for pretty low cost. And the last reason I have on this list that makes cavalry play just the best outcome for beginners is the fact that the Knight is actually way better against its counter units than any other unit in the game to some extent. So in this particular point, I want to just mention that monks hard counter Knights at early castle age, but the thing is monks are really not prevalent amongst beginners. It's really hard to micro monks, one of the most difficult units to micro. So it's not exactly prevalent at lower level play or beginner play to begin with. And besides monk, nothing really hard counters the Knight to where it's like impossible to deal with. For example, the pikeman is a really good counter in one-on-one combat, but the Knight can use its mobility to avoid fights against the pikes. Crossbows are okay, but then again, if you can surround the crossbows, you can easily take them out. Cavalry archers are also okay. You can hit and run the Knights, but the Knights can easily catch up if the cavalry player's micro isn't perfect. And the cavalry archers really die to Knights if the Knights can close the gap. So the enemy player better be playing perfectly with its cavalry archers, or else the Knights will close the gap and take him out. And if you just consider the other units in the game and how bad their counters are, you'll quickly understand that the Knight is just a lot easier to use even up against counter units. For example, take into consideration the archer line. Archer line gets hard countered by skirmishers, which, granted, if the skirmisher player doesn't have +2 armor, you can manage, but they also get hard countered by siege, assuming that the micro isn't great on either side. Siege can easily deal with big masses of crossbows, and they're also really bad against mass cavalry if you don't micro well. That's just kind of like the fact that you gotta consider here. If the micro isn't great and you're caught out, mass cavalry will actually counter crossbowmen. If you consider some other unit as well, let's say the longswordsman, it has some characteristics of the Knight. It's tanky and it's really good in melee combat, but it's really slow, so it dies to pretty much any archer unit. It also is not that great at raiding, since it's not really good against town centers and defensive buildings. Unless you've got enough longswords or enough infantry to take out those defensive buildings, you'll be taking quite a bit of damage from them, since your pierce armor is slightly lower than a Knight's. And so the longsword does kind of suffer against some of these counters. It's also weak against siege like scorpions and mangonels to some extent if we're using the attack round a little bit. And so in general, the longswordsman, while it doesn't have any direct counters aside from like slingers or whatnot in castle age, it does have a lot of units that soft counter it, and I just don't think the longsword is that good into its soft counters. I'd much prefer the Knights. And if you go back to the Knight for a second, even the Knight up against like a weaker army of pikes, less pikes, the Knights can easily overrun, and using Lanchester's Law, you can easily take really good engagements against the pikes. As you engage 30 on 30, for example, because a few pikes will initially fall, the Knights can easily pick up a good fight as less and less pikes are there to put out the damage, and Knights can win with an overwhelming amount of Knights left over. Obviously, pikemen over time will win, but oftentimes in beginner play, there's a lot of resources being floated. Not all the resources are being spent and being put on the field, and so oftentimes the guy who's just going Knights takes better trades, and ends up snowballing. Now, there is one caveat to this knight strategy. It's not like cavalry play will always win you the game. Of course not. If that were the case, this game would not be balanced. It's just a little bit easier to execute and easier to understand your win condition when playing cavalry. The one downside to this strategy, though, is that you have a hard time surviving in feudal, especially against spears and archers. I've done a lot of coaching, and this seems to be the biggest problem for beginner players. Up against spears and archers, when you're going scouts into knights, seems to be a huge issue. And don't worry, there is a really easy way to counter spears and archers, which is just a simple skirm transition followed by getting fletching and armor on the skirms. This will keep you safe, or you can fully wall your base. Both of those are really easy on paper counters to archers and spears. However, sometimes I feel like the scouts player just doesn't have time to do either and ends up losing to the spears and archers. This is extremely common amongst beginners, and it seems to be the biggest downside to playing cavalry. I do believe, though, if the cavalry player gets the castle age, they have a significant advantage over the guy who's going infantry and the guy who's going archers or any other units. Let me know if this aligns with your experience. Remember guys, I'm just talking from what I see, but I could be wrong on a lot of this. Do let me know in the comments below what you think about the topic, if this matches exactly what you've been experiencing, and if you want to give cavalry play a shot after being stuck with archers at 1000 ELO, 900 ELO, or any other ELO. I highly recommend it if this is something you're thinking about. Like, comment, subscribe if you did enjoy the video, and feel free to check out my links like Twitch for my live streams and Patreon for extra guides and build builders if you're interested. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you guys next time. Peace.